There's just something about them. They just love you and show you that incredible affection, and they tell you that you're wonderful, and they make you feel like everything's going to be okay, because dogs are probably above all else hopeful creatures. They experience every minute as if it was going to be wonderful. They know such great joy. And they share that with us sometimes when we can't find joy ourselves. And I think that's a big deal.
I'm Kate Tucker, and this is Hope is My Middle Name. Today, I am so excited to share my conversation with Jennifer Arnold. She's the founder and executive director of Canine Assistants, a service dog school on a big old farm in Milton, Georgia, where Jennifer and her team teach golden retrievers, Labrador retrievers, golden lab mixes, and golden doodles how to help folks who are struggling live better, safer lives. The dogs at Canine Assistants learn how to help people who use wheelchairs or have other difficulties with mobility. They can alert people who have epilepsy about the onset of a seizure, and they can warn those with type 1 diabetes when their blood sugar is about to go out of range. As hospital dogs, they support families, patients, healthcare workers, and first responders in the hard work of survival. These dogs can literally save lives. As you'll hear, working with these dogs is intensely personal for Jennifer, and that's how and why she's developed her own approach to teaching dogs, which she explains is very different from training them. She also shares some amazing stories about what these wildly smart and intuitive animals are capable of, and why we humans are so gosh darn lucky that these dogs love us the way that they do. Hello, Jennifer. It's so good to get to talk with you today.
Hi, Kate. Thank you so much for having me.
When you were a kid growing up, did you have pets? And what was kind of your first experience really bonding with a dog?
Gigi was my first dog. And I loved her so much that I'd have to call home from school to be sure the gate was closed. I was so afraid somebody would let her out and the gate into the backyard would be open and something would happen to her. We loved each other desperately.
So when you were 16, you were diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. What was it like to discover that you had that? What were the symptoms and how did that unfold?
It was terrifying. I got up one morning to go to the bathroom like normal, and I tried to stand up and I kept falling on the floor. And I was hospitalized and they diagnosed me as having multiple sclerosis. I could hear the doctors talking to my mom and dad in the hallway, and they were talking about their goal. And they said their goal was to try to keep me from getting worse, but they weren't certain that I would get a whole lot better, which meant that I'd need to use a wheelchair. And that devastated me. I didn't know anybody except maybe a couple of older adults who used wheelchairs. I didn't know how you lived like that. It was before places were accessible. So, for example, I couldn't go back to the school I'd gone to since I was in pre-K because it wasn't accessible. And
wow.
I'm ashamed of myself, and I know I shouldn't be. I know I was a teenager and that's a hard time, but I've met so many extraordinary people who had a different reaction that I'm kind of ashamed that I basically gave up.
Oh, it was so out of the blue. I can't imagine that happening right now, let alone as an adolescent when your whole life is stretched out in front of you and you have all these hopes and dreams, and then suddenly you can't see your friends.
Well, and they were kind of scared of me a little bit, just because they didn't know what to say or do. And I was the fourth and final child. And I was my dad's girl. He was an ophthalmologist and eye surgeon in Atlanta, and his practice was very stable by the time I was born. And so he had more time to spend with me. And he had just read an article in a medical journal about a woman in California whose name is Bonnie Bergen, who was training dogs to help people who use wheelchairs. He reached out to Bonnie Bergen, but unfortunately, she just had a couple of dogs in her home. No way she could send a dog all the way to Georgia. But my dad got kind of excited and thought, if I needed a dog in Atlanta, there were going to be other people in our area that did too. Maybe this was something I could do with my life. I remember him sitting on the edge of my bed saying, "You are where you are, and this is something I think you could do that nobody else really can, because who better to teach dogs to help other people who use wheelchairs?" And I got excited about it because that made sense to me. That was something I could focus on.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, all these years later, I have to really fight to keep from crying. But my dad was walking home from my grandmother's house. She lived a block over, and a drunk driver on a motorcycle jumped up on the sidewalk and hit him. And he died the next morning in the hospital where he worked. And it was the only one that stayed there overnight. I don't know exactly how that happened, except it was just total chaos, and I wasn't leaving my dad. So I was in my little wheelchair in the ICU waiting area. In my head, I knew he wasn't going to survive. I mean, first I thought, well, I quit this life thing. It's too hard.
Yeah.
Why would you do this? Then I thought, if there is a God, I hate you. And finally, I thought, screw you. If there's something I can do that makes life better for people here, I'll stay.
Yeah.
He died early that next morning, and I knew he was going to go. And I just, I guess you always hold out hope. So it took me a little while to regain my equilibrium when it actually happened. But when people say that I've done a good thing here, I almost feel guilty because it's what saved my life. So I feel like the motivation, at least to a large extent, was very selfish. But I am grateful that I have had this opportunity. And I hope at this point, not only to make it better for people who are struggling, but I'd also like to make it better for dogs. I owe them a lot.
Yeah. I always think it's funny, and it's totally understandable, but when, you go through a loss like that, it's not the same exact thing as what you were describing with your friend suddenly not knowing how to treat you when you were in a wheelchair. But it's a similar sort of thing where your friends kind of don't know, if they haven't experienced that, what to say. Then you feel so alone in that grief.
You are alone in it. Even people who are experiencing the same loss, I think, don't experience it exactly the same way.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a lonely thing.
Yeah.
And we went broke. My dad was not a great business person, and the circumstances were just surreal almost. The life insurance that he had an exclusionary clause against death by two-wheeled vehicle, obviously intended for people who were driving or riding on motorcycles.
Oh.
So we were encouraged to fight it in court. It ended up being upheld, and we lost the insurance company's court costs. And my mom and I learned a lot. We learned a lot about bagged cereal. It's much less expensive.
Yeah.
It took us over 10 years to finally start the program. But it was what I held on to every day.
Yeah.
I knew I was going to do it. I just had to get there.
So when you say it took you 10 years, you knew from the moment you lost your dad, you were on that path, that was what was going to get you through. But was there a conversation with your mom? Was there a moment where you made the commitment and started to take steps? I mean, make the plan?
Oh, yeah. We talked about it. We had long talks about it. At first, we had to focus on kind of survival. But once I got better, and I did, after a little over 2.5 years, my diagnosis has since been changed from MS to a condition called relapsing polychondritis. Rather than it being the covering of the nerves that are affected, it's the cartilaginous tissue in your body. Once my health got better, we started focusing on putting money away. And I did amazing things. I delivered pizzas. I learned to shoe horses. And we found this 10-acre place with a house on it. And we started a kennel. We took all the dogs that nobody else would take, dogs that veterinary clinics even didn't want to take because they were dogs who were biters and wore diapers. They were just the nightmare kind of dogs.
What was it like when you finally opened in the Canine Assistants purview? How many dogs did you start out with?
We had 17 or 19, I can't remember right now, inquiries for service dogs before we got our brochures back from the printers. Wow. We were slammed from the second we said we would do this, and it has never let up since then. The need is stunning.
Tell me about maybe one of the first dogs you paired with someone. Who was it, and how did it make you feel?
Well, we adopted for the first 6 years all of our dogs from shelters and rescue programs.
Oh, wow, okay.
And Lucy the Border Collie was what we would now kindly say a lot of dog. She was a busy girl, but brilliant. And this young man, Trey, had Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And they were our first pair. It's hard in a way to let go of the dog that you've loved and nurtured and agonized over and agonized with. But you fall so in love with the people too. I always say I would give the people on our waiting list a kidney and most of my liver, maybe both kidneys. You would do anything to make it better. And so I think I was elated and sad. And that continues today. The day after graduation, there are a lot of tears around here.
Yeah.
Happy and sad.
And I'd imagine back then when you're working with shelter dogs, so you're also training them to even just be around people, maybe some of them, or to get over some of the trauma they've experienced. It would have been such a different scenario than today.
I will say, adopted dogs can easily become assistance dogs, provided they haven't experienced too much trauma. I mean, they've all experienced trauma just by virtue of the fact that they've ended up in rescue. But this is what finally really convinced me that it was okay to have a breeding program. When I realized the amount of pressure we were putting on these dogs who had been hurt in the past.
Yeah.
It's a lot to ask of them. I feel like most of the dogs who end up in shelters or in rescue deserve a family who will do nothing but love them and make life better. And asking them to take somebody through the Atlanta airport when that person might lose consciousness, that's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot of pressure.
Yeah. Let's talk about what the dogs are capable of doing once you've taught them. So for someone, say with a mobility issue, let's start there. What does it actually look like? Is there an example of a dog or story you can tell where you've taught a dog and then they're going to do what?
Well, we had a dog whose young man was on a ventilator, 16-year-old kid, and he really wanted to be able to spend some time alone. He was a high quad on a ventilator as the result of a car accident, and his mom was the driver. I mean, I don't think we can really imagine how much that scarred her, but she didn't want to leave the room. And the primary reason she didn't want to leave his room was because ventilators, especially then, this has been a while, secretions like mucus would make it jam up and it would shut off.
Yeah.
And in order to restart it, you would have to hit a button that suctioned it and it would restart. But when it stopped functioning, he wasn't getting any air. One day, the mom had gone to get the mail and a neighbor had stopped her to talk at the end of the driveway. And when she came back into her house, in the foyer, as she entered, there was blood everywhere. And she ran into her son's room, and the ventilator was fine and functioning normally, but his dog was covered in blood. She went back out and looked in the foyer. There were huge claw marks in the front doors.
Oh.
When the ventilator shut off, a little alarm rings, and it was her job, the dog's job, to run and get Mom. And the alarm sounded, and she tried to get to Mom, but couldn't. So she tried to dig her way through the front doors, and she ripped off multiple toenails. And before the young man lost consciousness, he remembered seeing her run back in his room. There is no explanation for what happened other than she hit the reset button.
Oh, my gosh.
She had seen it done, repeatedly.
That's incredible.
And I find that extraordinary. So they learn to do things like pick up what you drop, tug open doors, push buttons, go for help in emergencies. But they often put those things together in new ways. They're amazing. They care. That's the biggest thing. It's not that they physically do these things.
Yeah.
It's why do they love us so much? How did we get that lucky?
There's so much science even still trying to understand that, but I think it's beautiful and maybe beyond our understanding, because love is not something that you can always quantify or measure.
No, but we know now from science, we know from fMRIs done on dogs that show the pleasure center of their brain explodes with blood flow when they see, hear, feel the touch of, even smell their favorite human.
Yeah.
More than it does for their favorite animal companion, more than it does for steak or whatever their favorite treat is. They adore us.
Let's talk more about some examples. Like you mentioned before, how powerful the support can be for someone with epilepsy. What do dogs do with someone with epilepsy?
A young man came in our office one day. He kind of slammed into the office and he looked at me and he said, "Are you in charge?" And I said, "Well, I guess so."
Yeah, how do you
I
answer
don't
that?
know. What do you want? And he said, "I have epilepsy and you're going to train a dog for me."
Oh, wow.
And I said, "Well, I have no idea how to do that." But his story was he was appointed to West Point while he was in the military. And it was his dream to go to West Point. And 2 weeks after he got there, he had his first epileptic seizure.
Oh.
And he couldn't stay. You can't serve if you have epilepsy. And when he came into our office, he was trying very hard to decide between living and choosing not to live.
Mm.
This dog thing for him was a lifeline. That really resonated with me. So we figured it out. And we still didn't know to what stimuli the dogs were responding when they could tell in advance, and they can tell in advance that a seizure is oncoming.
Mm.
So some years after we started placing dogs with people who have epilepsy and taking it on faith, we entered a research project with Florida International University in Miami, and they identified 3 volatile organic compounds, 3 VOCs released by the body prior to seizure onset.
Mm.
And once we knew that, it got a whole lot easier because you can recreate that odor in the lab. In the beginning, poor dogs, the method of the day was to expose the dog to the odor over and over and over and over again and pair that with a treat. The way we do it now, we expose the dog once, maybe twice. Once they smell the odor, they've got that. They don't need to smell it again. They need to know how to communicate that they smell it. So we teach our dogs to answer binary yes, no, either, or questions. So you can say, "Do you smell your smell?" If their smell is seizure. Do you smell your smell? Yes or no? And we put our hands out as we say, yes, the left hand goes out because I'm left-handed. And no, the right hand goes out. And the dog will look at or touch the appropriate hand. And I think because we don't give them a treat, we give treats to our dogs because they breathe. They don't have to do anything else to earn it.
Yeah.
We don't want them to feel like they need to tell us something that maybe isn't true, so they get a treat and some affection. It's taken years for the medical community to believe that this phenomena actually exists. They're finally there, and a wonderful neurologist, epileptologist in Denver named Ed Ma has been instrumental in getting them there. But the first time I ever took a dog who can recognize the smell of oncoming seizures to Denver, I was going to do a demo, and Dr. Ma asked a nurse, they had just had a patient have a seizure. He asked a nurse to go and collect a sweat sample from the palm of that person's hand and bring it in, and we were going to see how the dog responded to that sample. Well, she came back in holding the little swab, and she gave it to me, and I let my dog smell it. And I said, okay, do you smell your smell? Yes or no? And she hit no. And I was thinking, oh, crud. Don't mess up. You've never messed up before. Don't mess up now. So I asked her again. And the third time I asked her, she took her little nose and hit my right hand over and over and over again, like it isn't there. And I looked up and said, I'm sorry. She says the smell isn't there. And the nurse was standing there with her mouth open. And she said, it isn't there. I brought you a blank swab.
Whoa.
So, it's nice to know they're going to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
And with type 1 diabetes, they do the same thing, except that they have to add an extra layer in. So you say to the dog, is my blood sugar out of range? Yes or no? And if the dog says yes, you then ask, is it high or low?
Wow.
And they tell you, and they are accurate.
That's amazing. What about when someone isn't able to ask?
Yeah, they get to the point where they do it without being asked. We had a dog, an amazing golden doodle named Mossy. One day, her mama went to Kroger, and as they were leaving the grocery store, and Mossy had gotten in the back of the car, this very well-mannered dog jumped up to the front, and as her hand was trying to turn the key in the ignition, Mossy took her paw and knocked her hand away.
Mm.
And at first, her mom fussed at her and said, Mossy, cut that out. What are you doing? Get in the back of the car. And she just wouldn't give it up. And finally, she realized something was going on. And she checked her blood sugar, and she was down well below 50 and probably would have lost consciousness on her way home.
Oh, my gosh.
Had Mossy not told her. What's so dangerous about type 1 diabetes is the people who can't tell when their sugar's low. That's a real issue. And the dogs are about 20 minutes ahead of most glucose monitors. And they used to get in trouble for that. Originally, everybody thought, well, dogs just aren't very accurate. The dog alerts and the monitor says everything's fine. And then finally, somebody was smart enough to notice that the dog alerts, and 20 minutes later, the monitor says everything's not fine.
Oh, my gosh.
So there is likely some odor that precedes the smell of high and low, and the smell of it dropping, and the smell of it rising. My favorite description of how brilliant dog noses are is if you put it in visual terms, what we can see clearly from a third of a mile away, a dog would be able to see with equal clarity from 3,000 miles away.
Oh,
that's how much better their noses are. I mean, they're extraordinary. They smell parts per trillion.
Yeah. You're also placing dogs in hospitals across the country. Tell me about that.
Well, we started here in Atlanta at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, and we noticed these dogs are also lifesavers. They provide enough support so that people who are really struggling can keep going. And parents will tell you that having the dog in the room with their child gave them a glimpse of hope that one day they would laugh again, that this wasn't where they were going to be stuck forever. I've been the most surprised with the hospital dogs about the impact they make on the staff.
Oh, yeah.
You don't necessarily think about that. But, there's a surgeon who has reserved a dog for 10 minutes prior to surgery and 10 minutes plus after every surgery. He does oncology. So he deals with bad things.
Yeah.
And he swears that the dog has kept him from retiring early, which is awesome. And honestly, I kind of believe him. There's just something about them. They just love you and show you that incredible affection. And they tell you that you're wonderful. And they make you feel like everything's going to be okay, because dogs are probably above all else hopeful creatures. They experience every minute as if it was going to be wonderful, unless they've really been traumatized. They know such great joy. And they share that with us sometimes when we can't find joy ourselves. Yeah. And I think that's a big deal. These guys attach easily and quickly to new people, and that's important, especially for the hospital dogs. That's the toughest gig there is, I think, working in a hospital for one of our dogs.
Yeah. I read one of your clients said that her dog makes her feel like her wheelchair disappeared. What do you think she means by that?
I know exactly what she means. When anything about you is different, I think people mostly intend to be kind. But in that effort, they ignore you because they don't want to stare. And so they just don't look at you at all. When you've got this gorgeous dog next to you, everybody smiles. Our dogs all used to wear these patches that say, "Please don't pat me, I'm working." And people would pat the dogs anyway. So we went to ask to pat me, I'm friendly. So I think they make a difference when they're out in public.
Yeah. So in 2012, you developed the bond-based approach to teaching dogs. Could you give us a brief definition of what bond-based teaching is? What is the bond-based approach?
So the bond-based approach is asking rather than telling. All my life in dog training, I was taught that you never ask a dog, you always tell. And we've let go of that idea completely. We know that provided the dog feels safe and secure and capable, you can ask and they will respond.
Yeah. Take me to the moment when you realized that what you were doing or what you had learned prior just wasn't working. What were you struggling with and why did you do that?
Well, it started when I was giving the dogs going into training camp where they would meet their future humans. Every dog we had to start on Imodium because they were going to have diarrhea in camp. And I thought that's because we increased the number of treats that we used. But I started getting suspicious and thinking that it was at least partially because of stress. I also did train the trainer classes for people who wanted to learn how to work with service dogs. And I'll never forget, we had this woman come from, I think, Ohio. She was working on a dog for her son, and she asked if she could come to this class and if she could bring the dog. And I said yes. And it was this lovely golden retriever, male, about 8 months old. And he just was so nice. He was playful when it was time to be playful, but otherwise he would just relax and lie down right next to her. And we all said, "What kind of training have you done with him?" And I'll never forget what this woman said. She said, "I loved him. That's about it." And, I started thinking, wow, we may not be looking at this in the right way, which led me to look at why we train animals the way we train them. And it's because we've gotten stuck in the psychological, educational school of behaviorism, of classical and operant conditioning. And while they both exist and can be effective, reward and punishment is not a great way to develop a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
People will say, well, we train, but it's all positive. But that's not possible, because even the absence of reward is in itself punishing.
Mm.
And so we started by saying we're not going to make food or affection contingent upon the dogs pleasing us in some way. It's not necessary. And honestly, it's a little bullying when you think about it. I mean, they can't get food for themselves. So you're going to make them do tricks to get a little piece of treat. And I never thought it was about that tiny piece of milk bone. I never believed that. I thought that little piece of milk bone has to symbolize something. And I think what it symbolizes is everything's okay. I care about you enough to look after you. I'm happy enough with you to provide for you. And I think it must be terrifying for a dog to believe that they have to somehow appease you in order to survive.
It sounds to me like you're taking them from what was a transactional sort of experience into more of a relational experience.
Totally. That is exactly what we're doing.
Yeah. How does it actually work? How do you start?
So, for example, with the bond-based approach, we teach concepts. So one of the concepts that we teach them early on is the concept of being gentle. You know, when faced with what we use initially is a stuffed toy that we treat as a human infant, we hold it like that and teach the dog that they have to be very gentle. And then they learn that and they're able to generalize that into other situations. So what we do first is we'll play hard with one of the toys first that they can play with and shake and tug and be as rough as they want to be with this toy. Then we bring out baby and we hold out baby with our arms positioned so that we can protect baby if needed. And if the dog starts to put his mouth on baby, we say, you're gentle with baby. And there is some tone of voice involved, I would say. And if they start to put their paws up on you, you say the same thing. And they're incredibly quick. Like, we don't do sessions like we used to when we trained. We just have the dog with us as we go through life. And we'll have a toy and a baby on top of the refrigerator. And we'll stop and go through this once. So when a toddler at a hospital runs toward the dog, when we used to train, we would tell the dog to sit and stay or to down and stay, which honestly is tantamount to pinning them in a corner. So now what we do is when the toddler runs toward the dog, we say, remember now, be so gentle like you are with baby, so gentle. So they know the concept. So in essence, we are not saying, if you do this, I'll give you a treat. Or if you don't do this, you're not going to get a treat. We say, we need you to remember, please do this. And once they're that connected to you and they feel safe, they do want to make you happy. I've never seen them turn down an ask. Now, I've had dogs, we ask a lot of yes/no questions. For example, I will say, I'd like to put your vest on now so we can go. May I put your vest on, yes or no? And I've had plenty of dogs say no. And, you just have to be prepared for that. And you ask again in a couple of minutes. And honestly, when you get to the third ask, they usually start thinking, well, this is so important to her. Let's just get this over with. And they're so much more stable. Like, when we used positive reinforcement, the dogs were so anxious all the time because they were looking for our next cue or command and waiting to get that treat. They're like, what do I have to do to get it? What do I have to do? I mean, if you fussed a little bit, you crushed them because they didn't have a super strong sense of self. With a bond-based dog, you can fuss. I mean, they're like, sorry, dude, but I needed to chase that deer for a second. And honestly, for the recipients, I mean, just having to direct the dog's every move practically is irritating because they don't think for themselves. You turn that thought off when you start training to a large extent. It's somewhat different with pet dogs. With pet dogs, it's not nearly as damaging as it is with working dogs whose only interaction with people is in this context. So I like it that they're smart enough to figure out what to do. A lot of times you don't even have to ask. I mean, they just think, yeah, that's a little one. I need to be really gentle.
So how long does it take to put them through the training program before you can actually start training the people who they'll be placed with?
Most of our dogs graduate at about 2 years of age. That's really just so they have time to grow up.
Okay.
And we want to be sure that they have the maturity to handle what is a tough job.
So in that process, you've loved on them like crazy. You've established a bond where they trust you. How do you transfer that over to somebody new?
Well, when the dogs are here with us, we first work on building a secure attachment with each puppy. And it's just like a secure attachment that a primary parent forms with a preverbal child. And we know from extensive research now that dogs form those attachments that are virtually indistinguishable from those formed by a preverbal child to a primary parent. Dogs will form that same kind of attachment to their primary human. And you want that to be very secure. So that secure attachment, once formed, allows them, just like with a young child, to then form secure attachments with others as they grow up. And while the people are here in our recipient camp for 2 weeks, we also do a very sort of overt ceremony of hugging the person and saying, we trust them, you can trust them. They usually match on Monday, and Thursday night, for the first time, they get to go to the hotel with their new person. And Friday morning, they usually come in pretty thoroughly attached. I think it's who you sleep with. It makes a big difference. They're really connected. And we miss them, and they love us, I think, always. But I also think they're glad to be in the spotlight, if that makes sense. I mean, here they're one of 100, and each loved individually like crazy, but they're not our one and only.
Yeah.
And I think they're happy to find somebody who sees them as their one and only.
So how do placements work, and how do you know which dogs are going to go where?
I don't. They tell me.
So you bring the people in, they get through the process of being able to be there, which we'll talk about, but also once they're there, you actually let the dogs self-select?
I mean, they're going to do it anyway, so we may as well go with it. I mean, you're going to be the most attracted to a dog who's the most attracted to you.
Yeah.
So that's going to be the dog that you pick anyway. And I've never had a dog who didn't find their person, and I've never had a person who didn't find a dog.
Wow. How many dogs have you placed since you started?
Almost 3,000.
Oh my gosh. And what does that look like annually?
Well, pre-COVID, we were at almost 100. We're now down around 60 or so, and I'm hoping that's where we'll stay.
Okay.
But we are trying a new way of helping people. We have a program that we're beta testing right now called Handle with Care. It's an in-home education for future service dogs. It's a homeschooling offering.
Wow, cool.
And so rather than having to wait on a waiting list it can be 10 years that you have to wait on it. And we have people die on our waiting list. That shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
We can teach people how to do this for themselves. I mean, we've cracked this code. So we're willing to share everything we know. And we ask families or individuals to find somebody who can act as a coach for them through this process. And we will give everything we have to the coach and provide 24/7 support to the coaches. The way it works now with the schools, it's not scalable.
Yeah.
We find out every year something else that dogs can do to help us. We're never going to catch up with the need unless we look at it differently. And this is how we've chosen to try and correct that.
So anyone in any state can apply to this program and have support from you on how to become a coach?
Well, first, the person who needs a dog would apply. They do something we call a pre-app that's available on our website, which is just canineassistants.org. And this is going to be bond-based.
Yeah.
So if we feel like the person is not going to be able to understand bond-based or just won't do that, then we have to say you're not a good fit for us. But if you are a good fit for us, then we ask you to find a coach. And with our beta tests, we've been lucky because we've been able to find people pretty easily. But as it gets larger, we're going to have to go into communities and ask people to donate their time to try to make this work for families. And then we go through everything from acquiring an appropriate candidate all the way through.
So it's starting with the need, the person who needs the dog.
Right.
And then that person finds a coach in their area?
Correct. If possible, if you need us to help you, that's when we jump in.
And what about if there's someone like my sister who's going to listen to this podcast and already has 3 dogs and a huge farm who wants to just learn how to be a coach and
be ready if somebody needs her?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. But hang on, let us finish the beta test and then we will. Although actually, I think that application is up on our website already. It's under community facilitator.
Do you hear that, Joe? All right, well, good. I think that's amazing. So I'd like to know a little more about how you select the people. So maybe not during the beta program, but just in your standard way of bringing people to camp. The waiting list is beyond what you can serve. How do you select who actually is placed with the dog?
That's pretty agonal. After the pre-app has been approved, and they've been approved basically to submit a complete application, we evaluate each applicant based on how much a dog can do to help that person physically, socially, emotionally, and medically, and how appropriate that placement is for a dog.
Wow.
How appropriate it is for the dog and how much the dog can do to help. So it's not first come, first serve, which is frustrating, but it's the way it has to be because occasionally people who apply can't afford to wait.
That's so much responsibility to have to make that decision.
We have a wonderful woman from California named Nicole Hearn who is responsible for that. She's a social worker by background, and it's not an easy thing to do.
No.
We average 4 pre-apps a day.
Wow.
It's a lot.
So once somebody is approved and they come to the 2-week camp and they bring the dog to the hotel and they go through that whole process, what happens next? I mean, what does support look like? Do you stay in touch with them? How does that all work?
There's a graduation that's really cool. And I used to hand the dog their diplomas all rolled up with a beautiful ribbon. And one dog helped me understand that looks a lot like a dog bone. So I don't do that anymore.
And way less satisfying.
That doesn't look good during graduation. Once they go home, especially initially, we stay in close touch. Our aftercare coordinator, Megan Hopkins, is incredible. And when we trained dogs, you could go home and the dog would sort of operate immediately. You could do all the retrieving and the lights and show off tugging the doors open, and you could go out to Trader Joe's. And with bond-based dogs, it takes several weeks to several months before you get there.
Okay.
Because by virtue of the design, the dogs aren't finished for you when you come, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You have to form that relationship. But what we've seen is the training way. It was later on, several months in, that we started hearing about problems as the memory of training with us faded.
Oh, I see.
The bond-based dogs, it just gets better and better. So as long as we can convince people to slow down and give the dog a chance to really acclimate, it works a lot better in the long run.
How much does it cost to kind of support a dog through its lifetime?
Well, from birth all the way through, and we provide veterinary care and even food for the life of dogs when families can't afford to do that. And that's close to $30,000 a dog.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a very labor-intensive endeavor. But years ago, I saw an estimate that approximately $36,000 in other medical, in like human attendance requirements is saved in the first 3 years of being matched with the service dog. So it's actually, they're cost effective.
In this work, I mean, how often are you thinking back to your father and his vision for it and maybe what he might think about where you're at now?
I think about him every day, and it pushes me to want to do better and give more and solve some problems that I see in the industry so that we can continue to ask dogs to help us. So, I mean, he's with me. And my mom, I lost my mom in 1997. I mean, she's with me every day too. So they're here.
So it's interesting you set out to build something where dogs would serve humans. And it seems that now your work involves helping humans understand how we can also participate in serving and loving our dogs.
Because it's the same thing. I mean, that's what I think it took me so many years to understand was that, and we've actually had donors. We had one big donor here in Atlanta stop supporting us because they said, we feel like you've become focused on the dogs. We have to be focused on the dogs. If we're not, they can't give the person everything they have. You know, so I feel like we were focused just on the people really in the beginning. And I mean, we tried to be kind to the dogs, but we had no awareness or limited awareness that what we gave the dogs impacted what they could give others.
Yeah.
So now I feel like we at least embrace the fact that for the dogs to be able to really do their job and do it well, we have to give them what they need.
What's giving you reasons to hope these days?
The dogs. Can't look at them and not have hope. It's how they greet every second of every day with this extraordinary hope that everything's going to go well. And I think that keeps you moving along.
It's so incredible. Oh, well, I am inspired and filled with hope. Thank you again, Jennifer.
My great privilege. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much to Jennifer Arnold, the team at Canine Assistants, and to the thousands of amazing dogs out there helping us live richer, healthier lives. To find out more about their work, visit canineassistants.org. This is the last episode of the season, but I'd love to stay connected. You can sign up for monthly emails at hopeismymiddlename.com. I'll be sending stories and inspiration. And if there's someone making a difference in your world, I would love to hear about it. Send me a message. Hope is My Middle Name is hosted and executive produced by me, Kate Tucker. You can find me on YouTube and on Instagram at Kate Tucker Music. And if there's someone you think belongs on the show, please send me a message. Hope is My Middle Name can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. It would mean a whole lot to us if you would follow the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. We love hearing from you. And if you're still listening, please copy the link to this episode and text it to a friend. That alone makes a huge difference in helping us reach more people with more hope. Hope is My Middle Name is a podcast by Consensus Digital Media, produced in association with Reasonable Volume. This episode was produced by Christine Fennessy with editing from Rachel Swaby. Our production coordinator is Percia Verlin. Our sound designer and engineer is Mark Bush. Music by the fantastic artists at Epidemic Sound, Soundstripe, and me. Big thanks to Connor Gallen, our publisher and fearless leader at Consensus Digital Media. And thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.